Morning, Dan. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good. I'm excited to have you on the show. As you and I were talking, I have not had a specific legal specialist, and specialist might not be the right word for you, but that is going to be able to touch on all the different bullet points that we are going to be able to cover in a way that it's actually not boring as heck. So I'm excited to have you on the show. We've worked with clients together, and you just have a different style and a different kind of model that I'm just excited to have the listeners understand that there's people out there like you that can really help. So without, diving too much into it, well, maybe give the listeners a background clip version, Dan, of your background, because I think it's an interesting even your designate or the degree that you got and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm excited to be here and excited and appreciative of that intro. I was an accounting and finance major in undergrad, and the decision to go to law school wasn't really about not wanting to do those things as it was about just sort of trying to build out the skill set a little further. I went to law school knowing I wanted to be a transactional lawyer and, kind of help people figure out how to buy a business or sell a business and obviously ultimately on the sell side, maximize value. And so that was just kind of always, in my head as an ultimate goal. So accounting and finance undergrad, and then went to law school and took every kind of transaction focused class I could, which thankfully, the law schools do a little better job about providing those opportunities, in the modern world than they did in the past. So got a chance to actually get some helpful training there, and then just got out and sort of tried to get involved in as many of those as quickly as I could. And now here, 15 years later, kind of have managed to mostly work on the kinds of things that I want to work on all day long. So it's been good.
I love it. And like the thing that I find is interesting, and you're going to laugh about this, because like I was doing this keynote and we were talking about, our 5 principles and such. And I was talking about the legal role, and they're like, no lawyers know what working capital is. So like the fact that you actually have a finance degree, I think is really interesting, and kind of that, and we'll tie that back into like the different kind of roles of attorneys. But I just think it's interesting because I don't know if you kind of comment on that, but knowing business and understanding business and transactions is just way different than just filling out a piece of paper.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting is people kind of get that piece wrong a little bit in both directions, right? I mean, some people assume that the lawyer knows nothing about that piece of it. And other people, assume that once they know you do know something, they assume you're going to kind of want to run point on that. And, for me, most of the deals I work on, there is somebody who's whether it's an investment banker or, an accountant or just an internal resource that is really a 10 out of 10 on that score and that skill set. And, oftentimes I'm sort of the wingman on that stuff, but I think the thing that it's really valuable to be able to understand what the person who's running point on the working capital discussion is doing, so that when we're negotiating other aspects of the deal where those issues are relevant, I'm not, in the dark. So, it's not like having the knowledge means that I'm trying to take over that piece, but it does help me, I think, be a better, teammate for whoever it is that's kind of running point.
I mean, well said, man. Like, I think you bring up a lot of good points in there. And what I want to dive into is especially like you said, having a surface-based knowledge of all these different things, but then where the different roles and responsibilities come in. But before we kind of go into like the transaction team and some of that stuff, Dan, like, can you just, we can kind of set the stage of like, what is a mergers and acquisition attorney? How does that compare to the big box shops? How does that compare to my brother-in-law who did my articles of incorporation, my general counsel? I mean, I think the role of an attorney is so unique because there's so many different kind of niches inside of the world of law that like you and I probably have stories. So you get where I'm going with that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's sort of like, saying what is an attorney is sort of saying what is an animal, right? I mean, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different answers to that. I think my role, and as you and I have talked about, I mean, I'd say my time is, divided pretty equally, probably ultimately between, my specialty, my area of expertise is M&A. The other thing I do a lot of is we just serve as in an outside general counsel role. And, so in that chair, obviously we see on a, daily basis, all the different kinds of issues, whether they be, employment or contract or regulatory or, tax. And so, I think these two things go really well together, because at the end of the day, I always think about an M&A attorney. I mean, I tell people my job, I'm a professional puzzle assembly person, right? I mean, my clients come and they dump a puzzle onto the table, and, I help them figure out how to put that puzzle together. And I think the couple key components of that are, one, you have skills and experience and expertise that you build through every transaction, but each transaction is unique. If you try to take the exact same approach to putting together, the train puzzle as you did to putting together, the shark puzzle, that's going to be a failure. And so, I sort of think every deal is different. Obviously we do deals both buy side and sell side. We do deals, from 5 million to 250 million. I think where we have some, I think really special, and positive dynamics at our firm is that we really are sort of relentless about looking at each deal independently and not trying to take, the deal and kind of jam it into our system, And so, I think to me, that's what, I think that there's a different, to your earlier point, doing M&A deals that are $10 billion deals or $100 billion deals, that's a different business than I'm in. Those people, the process that we've built and run here would have no utility there, and vice versa. And so we're not trying to be all things to all people. We're trying to have an approach that allows us to do these deals in this, lower middle market, efficiently, thoughtfully, and sort of on a customized basis. Well, and so that's, that's sort of how I would describe our,
which is good context. And I think that to even peel back a little bit farther too, because like as I describe to our clients or to any business owners that, and I might be totally wrong on this, but it's extremely efficient and works. But if you're going to have a legal professional like that is going to be packaging up and then helping you engineer an outcome, whether it's an ESOP or a third party strategic, or whether it's a private equity recap or an internal buy, every one of those is completely different. So like to your analogy, it's a different puzzle, but like in concept to get to like your analogies is like we're playing puzzles, right? Versus like a divorce attorney or a real estate attorney or someone else that's a different law designation doesn't do puzzles. And I think that's the biggest challenge. A lot of people are like, oh, you're an attorney, you must know this kind of stuff. So the fact that you're in the business of doing puzzles is different than someone else that might have a brother-in-law that's an attorney at a random small little firm.
Yeah. And I mean, on any given deal, I'm working with, somewhere between 2 and 6 specialists in my firm who have specialized subject matter expertise, whether it be real estate, employment, employee benefits, regulatory. And those people are coming in and I'm saying, here is this one issue that's come up in the context of this transaction. We need your help to sort of run this to ground. And they're doing, they're great lawyers, but they're doing something very different, right? They're doing one discrete task and coming back and saying, here's how we can fix this. Here's how we can solve this. And I'm then having to take that into the context of obviously a multidimensional, transaction and make sure that the solution that they're proposing doesn't jam us up elsewhere. And so, it's just a different, I would never say that, one role is more important than the other. They're all important, but it is very different. And to your point, I don't think that, the person who does one is necessarily very well suited to the other and vice versa.
Right. And like, what's interesting, Dan, like in kind of another layer of this discussion is that, when going back to my earlier point about the M&A attorney is like, I think the M&A attorney should be the project manager of almost all things legal. And that's where I think, to your point, the general counsel fits in pretty well, because like And, based on our model, we talk about sustainable, predictable, and transferable cash flow, which is the glue behind all this
Yeah.
is legal stuff, right? So you end up having to touch
Yeah.
all these things to transfer the cash
Yeah.
flow to anybody. So you have to
Yeah.
touch
Yeah.
all the different parts of it.
Yeah. And you have to be able to maintain kind of a bias towards seeing the forest first. I think if you get too deep, the danger of, missing the forest for the trees is real. And I like your comment about project management. I mean, I think that is a lot of what it's about. And, and then being a strategic thinker, which, I mean, probably other people can do more things at the same time than I can, but I don't think you can be kind of thinking about the transaction at a high level, trying to see it multidimensionally at the same time as you're down in the weeds trying to work through a 409A issue. I mean, those are separate things.
Yeah.
And I think it's, at least for me, again, it's just my limitation, but for me, it's hard to do both at the same time. So I try to stay up and keep my head up.
Well, and to the forest, to the puzzle, and what the picture is, right? So maybe we'll make this a little bit more tangible to people, because what I wanted to make sure that we're kind of covering some of these things is like, the due diligence process before and then during the transaction, and then kind of how the legal role fits into that. But then also, the different types of puzzles. I love this analogy. Obviously, you can tell, like, the difference between internal transition versus private equity versus ESOP, and how those are mirroring of what the preparatory work needs to be done. Because to your point, if you're looking at the bigger picture, you're trying to connect all these dots. So maybe we can kind of take a, I don't know which route you want to go first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just to your point about kind of preparing, I mean, I encourage people, I sit on some advisory boards for clients, and, we have meetings on a regular basis. And one of the things I always push, and I think it's one of the things that's really exciting and interesting about the work that you and your colleagues are doing, because I haven't perceived that there are very many people who are a good resource on this front. I mean, I always tell clients, let's pretend like you're going to sell your business at the end of the year and look at it through that lens and say, what are the things that are going to be impediments to maximizing value? And, even for clients that have no intention, that have a long runway and intention to own and run their business for 20 years. I mean, I think that's a great exercise, because it forces you, it's just a lens, it's a way to look at your business from a different perspective, the way that an outside party would if they were thinking about buying it. And having, people on your advisory team that can help you do that and can, help you be disciplined about doing that, because that takes some time and some bandwidth that, most business owners have plenty of things to devote their time and bandwidth to. And, but to me, looking at, to stick with the puzzle analogy, sort of the pre-transaction diligence failure is a missing puzzle piece, right? I mean, I don't care how good I am at putting puzzles together. If you give me a puzzle, a 400-piece puzzle where there are 10 pieces missing, this isn't going to turn out well. And to me, those pieces are, those are the, a problematic contract with a key customer, a regulatory exposure that is out there that, is significant, a failure to have key customer facing, sales folks locked down to some kind of non-compete, non-solicit. I mean, these kinds of key things that right away are going to undermine value. If you come in and dump the puzzle out and say, hey, I'd like you to put this together, and there's 10 of those key pieces missing, I mean, there's not going to be any, I don't have a magic wand. So we're gonna have a hard. Well, right. I mean, no, that's the thing. Sometimes somebody who hasn't done any of that prep work comes in and says, I want you to help me sell this business, and I have these 3 issues. I just want to be upfront about. I have these 3 issues, and my reaction to that is, well, I don't. We can't get you the value that you want and need with those three issues.
Well, and let's put some like you're totally right, and I want to keep going on this topic, because if we go back to like what creates a valuable company, it's the sustainable, predictable cash flow and transferable, right? So let's say someone's got $1 million in cash flow, and let's say if it's a financial buyer, like just for valuation, let's say it's a 5x, right? So it's worth $5 million. Well, if someone says, okay, like Dan, I want to buy your $1 million in cash flow. Well, as easy as we can do to transfer that, and like what you were talking about, the missing puzzle pieces, this is, well, your main sales guy doesn't have a non-compete and he has relationships with a third of the clients. Well, I'm not going to pay for that. And then like, by the way, we got sued and it's a pending litigation on a product default. Like, okay, like it's all this stuff that like it's not worth, you can't transfer that stuff. And I think, the challenge that people, I mean, you've probably seen, you got other examples of non-assignable contracts. Like they just didn't even think about that.
Yeah. Right. And that's why, I mean, we do work on both sides of the transactions. We represent buyers and sellers. And I really think when people talk about, do you ever think about specializing? I mean, absolutely not. I mean, I think it's critical to understand both sides of the transaction, because, when you're representing the buyer who brings some of the challenges you just described to the table, when you're representing the seller who's got, contract issues, how you view those issues from the buy side. And so that informs, thoughts about steps that seller can take to sort of, mitigate, the damage that those kinds of facts can do.
Well, and let's talk about the process of this, because, I've been preaching it for years, because I mean, I've gone through multiple transactions myself, and it's a full cavity search, right? Because if you think about it, if I'm going to buy your $1 million in cash flow, and I'm going to pay $5 million, maybe take out a $3 million loan and some equity in there, I'm going to make sure as hell that I cover all my bases, right?
Yeah.
So try and find all of these things. And so in that situation, there's, because I going back to my point, I was like, I preach like do due diligence now, because you can have like an out of the blue offer, but then what is that? What is the actual process coming from? Let's take it from your perspective, from the buy and the sell side, of what are the things that they're looking for, and how does that work? Let's say you were representing a buyer, because I think that would be good for the listener. Okay, how does that work, and what's the process?
Yeah, I mean, from the buy side, we're pretty much sitting down with the client and talking about the business. And this is where I think having a little bit of a business background helps, because I think you can be, conversant about what is driving this business relatively quickly. And so for me, the first conversation is a 10,000 foot conversation about what is this business? And to your point, what is it that we're buying? What is this income stream that we're buying? And what are the things that have the potential to disrupt it? And what are the things that have the potential to expand it? And, to me, you and I have had this conversation. I don't have, we have a few different templates that we use. Obviously, as a buyer, you are at an early point sliding a diligence checklist across the table and saying to the seller, here's the things that we want to know about. Right. We don't have one template for that checklist, and I've never sent out a checklist that didn't have some customization in it, because I think you've got to, right from the get-go, figure out what do we care about. And that's kind of what I'm talking about doing these lower middle market deals. I think, you get some advisors that'll take their template for a $400 million deal and try to drop it onto a $30 million deal. Well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, nobody can tolerate that level, that intensity of process. And so what we try to do is look at it and say, what really matters here? If I'm making up numbers for purposes of illustration, but if there are 100 things that we typically care about, we can look at a specific business and say, okay, these 33 really matter here. These 33 are sort of deserve some moderate level of scrutiny, but they're not key drivers. And these, 34 over here are not huge issues. We just need to kind of see enough to be able to have a comfort level. And, so I'd hesitate to say, just generically, here are the things that really matter. But I mean, obviously, number one is sort of who are the customers, who are the contacts with those customers, what is our history, what has gone wrong, what has caused us to lose customers, what has helped us gain customers. Because to me, the rest of the world whether it's regulatory compliance stuff, whether it's HR stuff. I mean, that's stuff that we as lawyers can probably fix, can probably figure out ways
or the
to
buyer can once they
inoculate
buy it,
our.
right? Like that's all fixed.
Exactly. Exactly. We can work with the buyer to figure out how to mitigate their risks on those things. But the revenue side stuff, you've got to get out in front of it. And that's where I say having somebody who's your partner, for an extended period before you're trying to sell, who can look at the business through that lens and say, here are 3 issues, 3 things that are missing puzzle pieces, and we can recreate them by taking these steps.
Well, and think about it too, Dan, because like that $1 million in cash flow, like if you don't get out in front of that and that goes away, like the whole thing doesn't work, right? You don't need IT or HR or payroll. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Like you need your profit and the cash flow coming in.
Right.
And like,
exactly.
Well, I was just saying, like, what people like this whole even thing about like assignable contracts. So like, what happens if like, we're working with a customer right now. You and I've got a couple of mutual ones, but like, it's like, if you're working with government, can that contract assign to someone else? And like, maybe this is a good time to talk about like the asset versus stock sale and how that EIN number works, because all this stuff is so important where you don't look at it, you don't even have the ability to sell at all.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, so a couple things. One thing I would say on the revenue side is I think, it's about 2 things. It's about, one, having your ducks in a row in terms of being able to explain why the revenue stream that you're trying to sell is predictable, is consistent, is protected. The other thing that I think is huge and is oftentimes the difference between, the really fun closing dinner is when a seller they rang the bell, right? I mean, they're thrilled. And those people that are ringing the bell, they've done that first thing. They've demonstrated that their revenue side is stable, predictable, protected. But the thing they've also done is they've shown that buyer reasons to be hopeful that there are additional opportunities that can be harvested. So they've shown them some upside. And that's where I think and that you can't create that overnight, right? I mean, that's where getting somebody involved early and talking about, hey, you need some more hunters, or you need to be hunting more of this kind of customer. Just somebody that's frankly, in the chair that you're sitting in, looking at this thing holistically and helping, with that piece. I think that,
like, you think about it, like, so like, let's go back to the $1 million cash flow and $5 million valuation. So like, let's say we put a $3 million loan on that and we put $2 million in equity into it. It's like, that's, first of all, I think the $3 million loan, what are the monthly payments of that is like, I think like 30 grand a month or something like that. So you're sitting there going, okay, well, I got like 400 grand in debt on $1 million in cash flow. I need to be able to grow this thing. Yeah. And so if you hand that, and I handed that to you and I sold my company, you'd go, okay, I know exactly what to do with my profits. You're handing it over with the, and like, going back to your point of the prepping of this stuff, like, you and I and some of the clients that we'd work with together kind of got this whole model and how we've been categorizing the advice from the advisors, whether we have like 1, 2, and 3 advice, or like, so level 1 is just gap, like, okay, your NDAs signed, you have all the articles of incorporation, your minutes, all that stuff. Then level 2, meaning you're ready for an out of the blue offer or any transaction, regardless of whether it's an internal ESOP third party, because we just know that it's transferable. And that, then the level 3 being like, we're engineering this towards a specific outcome. But like, how many times you see, like, in that level 2 of knowing that like something, an out of the blue offer happens, how many times do you have that happen where someone says, I don't want to sell? And if I had $1 for this, I swear to God, for every time it happens, but I don't want to sell. And then an out of the blue offer happens and they have nothing put together. Like, how many times, I mean, what is your advice to people about that, or what's your experience with it?
Yeah, I mean, it happens with regularity, right? Yeah, and you don't really, sometimes you understand what the drivers are, and sometimes even being in the room with a good viewpoint, it just seems totally random. And that's sort of why I just think, it's, to me, everybody has a price at which it makes sense to sell, right? I mean, and frankly, there's a point at which you're crazy not to, right? I mean, if you have an opportunity to harvest great value and take those chips off the table and redeploy them elsewhere. And so I kind of push pretty hard when clients say there's no scenario where I'm going to sell, because I just think that's ultimately not a very thoughtful answer. And I think to me that reflects a lack of really willingness to devote some time and energy to thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
And, so so I kind of try to use to get people to acknowledge that, yes, there is that scenario, and then to see the benefit of spending some time, again, whether it's quarterly or even just annually. I mean, just getting in the habit of dedicating some time and finding some advisors that can help you actually get some return on that investment of time by mapping out what does this look like and what are our problems. And, I would go back to your question about stock versus asset. I mean, obviously an overgeneralization, but almost always better for a seller to sell their stock, almost always preferable for a buyer to buy assets. And, one of the things when you're on the set, when I talk to people about this idea that they need to be thinking about their exit for, they need to have some runway. They need to be thinking about that for a period of time before they're actually going to be ready to do it. I always say, let's try to position this thing so that we can make a straight-faced argument that this thing is so buttoned down that a stock sale doesn't, that a buyer doesn't have any reason to have any legitimate heartburn about buying the stock. And then if we're in that position, then we actually have the ability to if the buyer does insist on doing a stock deal, we actually have the ability to, doing an asset deal, then we actually have the ability to say, well, fine, we'll do it, but then you're going to pay the difference, the tax difference for us. What happens to sellers who aren't ready is these buyers get in there and the seller says, well, I want to sell stock. And the buyer says, because the buyers are sophisticated, they say, oh, well, we usually buy assets, but we're open to that. So let's just kind of get the process going and we'll figure it out. And then they get in there and they find a couple things that are problematic. And they now have a bulletproof reason to say to the seller, we're not going to buy stock. And when they're in that position, you're never going to get the increased purchase price on an asset deal to mitigate, the tax cost. And so, your question about stock versus asset to me is a great lens through which to view, the challenges that you can have if you don't get started, getting your house in order.
Well, and if you think about it, Dan, and right now, especially because of like the economy, people trying to manufacture growth and lowest interest rates, the whole M&A marketplace is very interesting. PE firms are overspending. Mm-hmm. So you have these people that are getting paid to spend money to buy companies. So, I call it a fishing expedition, right? So you say, okay, Dan, I want to buy your company for $5 million. So let's just take this example again. And then you go, oh, that's interesting. Like I could maybe do that, and then you think, okay, well, first of all, have you even ran the numbers of it, whether it's an asset or stock, how much and pay off debt, how much money you're going to actually walk away with compared to your $250,000 salary? And then you say, okay, well, you start that whole process. Maybe you can kind of give the lens of so it's like that, you get an offer and then there's a letter of intent. Well, you can't renegotiate, right? So you're sitting there going, okay, well, and where I'm getting to the point of the deal structure. So let's say as I'm a buyer trying to buy your company and I say that, so you maybe walk through as you watch the seller go through the mental process of going from 5 million to wait, how much is up front? What happened in due diligence that reduced that purchase price? And then what are the different ways that the buyer push the deal structure, escrow and earnouts and all that? So can you maybe kind of walk what happens to the 5 million all the way down to what actually happens at closing?
Yeah. So, obviously it usually starts with a conversation, with the prospective buyer and the seller. That's step one. They get connected at a trade show or whatever. And the buyer says, would you ever think about it? And the seller says, yeah, I'd think about it. And they kind of have that conversation and there's an openness and they, that then translates into, potentially depending on size of the deal and who the players are. It might go right to a letter of intent, or there might be an interim, just kind of a term sheet. Oftentimes maybe it's just an email or a one-page document that just sort of lays it out at a very high level. And, then you go to a letter of intent that gets a little more, gets a little bit more into the detail, and then obviously ultimately negotiate a definitive agreement and close the transaction. I think, one of the things I always try to do every once in a while, we've all seen this, there's a lightning bolt. There's something that, there is a buyer who has a unique position where they come across a business that they have unique reasons to need, and they make an offer that just doesn't make any sense. It's too good, right? It's one of those too good to be true. And that happens very rarely. And when it does, we've had some of those where I've said, you know what, we've got to just pursue this because this really is too good to be true. The multiple's too good to be true. The buyer, that there's so much synergy and strategic advantage for the buyer that they're willing to pay more than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
But set those aside because those are unicorns, right? I mean, you don't build process based on unicorns.
I think a lot of people try to, but yeah, I agree.
Well, right. I know. And that's part of the problem. I mean, to me, you talk about what are the danger points. I mean, to me, every one of those checkpoints that I talked about is a danger point for the seller. And that's where I hate to keep coming back to the same thing, but that's where having some process on the front end, getting your ducks in a row really comes into play. I've got a deal right now where we're down the road, and closing in on, having a definitive agreement. And you still have open issues. And, when you have a seller who has a business that's running really well, who has all their ducks in a row, who has all their contract stuff figured out, you will never, until you get the wire, you will never stop facing attempts by the buyer to make the deal a little better for them.
Yeah.
And the best tool that you have to thwart those attempts is, your business is saleable to 10 other people,
right,
because of how dialed in it is. So to me, there's risk for a seller at every one of those points. And the best way to mitigate that risk is not to think, that you can have some kind of magical LOI that'll eliminate anybody's ability to try to renegotiate or retrade, because that doesn't exist. The LOI always gives the buyer the opportunity to revisit issues in the form of definitive agreement. So really, you're going into that battle with the only protection you have and the only lever you have is you have a good, strong business that could sell to any one of 10 people, and you can keep reminding the buyer every time they try to get one more tweak in their favor. You can keep saying, as we said last time, the answer is no. And if you don't like the deal, then we'll go sell to these other guys.
Yep. Well, and man, Dan, you just nailed it on that. I mean, you're totally right. The only leverage you have is other buyers. And let's walk through those checkpoints and give some tangible examples. So let's say you have two different people, right? So you got one that's got all their ducks in a row. They've got 10 people and they can keep saying no. But what are the explain in maybe some detail on what they might come back to renegotiate? Because I said that I would buy your company for $5 million.
Yeah.
I think about an asset sale.
Yeah.
So checkpoint one, we go from asset to stock, from stock to asset.
Yep.
Okay. So there I lose, I lose $500,000. And then at these other checkpoints, what are deal structure things that could happen? Let's say things come up. What's the kind of the back and forth?
So, I mean, a couple examples, right? They could see some issues with customers, with key customers, and they could say, you know what, we've got reason to be concerned about the status of the relationship with customer A. And so we're gonna, we want an earn-out component. We offered to buy your business for $5 million, and we'll still give you $5 million, but now we want to give you $3 million and $2 million in the form of this earn-out. And and I've done this on the buy side, right? I mean, the buyer will say, well, don't worry, if you perform just like you are today, you'll get the other two. And, so they sort of set it up as, if you're the seller, they want you to feel like you'd be unreasonable to object. But of course, the problem is they will be running the business. So if they're looking at the business and saying, we have actually a strategic objective to move away from, business line one and put more of our energy in the business line two, if that's the way buyer's thinking, there may well be a short, post-closing, there may well be a short-term, sort of step back for the business in order for them to achieve their long-term objectives. Well, if you're dealing with an earnout, if you just got $2 million of your $5 million moved over to an earnout, that might cost you $2 million. So
I know,
that's one that happens. The other one that'll happen is, if you have a regulatory exposure or contract issue, they'll say, we want to put $1 million in escrow for, a year pending resolution of this issue. And, again, it's sort of when the buyer presents it, it sort of sounds like, well, that's not unreasonable and we'll eventually get our money and I'm confident we can work through it. But, that's the devil's in the details on these things. I mean, oftentimes you end up with the money in escrow and you end up with the buyer saying, no, you didn't really eliminate that risk. And the seller's saying, yeah, I did. I mean, you'd have to have, a lightning bolt and a hurricane and an asteroid all at the same time for you to have a problem. And they say, well, yeah, but that could happen. So,
yeah,
so, I mean, those are, that's a couple examples. I mean, obviously there's a million ways that can happen, but my point is it to me, it all comes back to, as the seller, you've got to have a performing business and all your ducks in a row, because that's ultimately how you're going to fend off these attempts, which, with a few exceptions, I mean, almost every buyer is going to at some point try to get a little better deal.
Well, and the thing behind all this, Dan, is hopefully this is for everybody that's listening, that it's tangible stories, right? Because I mean, so many people, Dan, like, I get the pushback out there. We're not ready to sell. I'm like, you have no idea what the game is that you're going to play. And you're going to do this once, right? So these buyers know all this stuff. So I always joke around that the buyers or the sellers are playing checkers. So they're, jumping pieces. And then the seller's playing checkers and the buyer's playing 3D chess and 3 boards at a time. And they go, okay, well, so the seller gets infatuated with this $5 million mark. And then if you think about your example of, let's call it the 5 million. So you get 3 million up front, and if it's an asset sale. So you're going, okay, well, I get 50% in tax and I have $1 million in debt. They might only walk away with $1 million, and then you go, well, I got 2 million in earnout, which has different tax ramifications. I mean, you're talking, you might get $1.5 million out of the whole $5 million sale.
Well, and to me, that's why I think one of the many things that I think is critical in terms of, the work that the potential seller needs to do on the front end before they're even in this conversation is they need to have, one of the things that these sellers need to do, and this just goes with being willing to dedicate some time and bandwidth to thinking about these things. I mean, they need to go through an analysis with their tax advisor, of what does a sale look like, and really have a really clear understanding of what they feel like they need. And I just feel so much better when we go into a deal where we have that on the front end, because then when, everybody gets sick of these deals, right? I mean, even a $15 million deal, I mean, depending on who your buyer is, I mean, they can move quickly, but if there's no, external, sort of driver that forces it onto a faster timeline, I mean, this can be, a 6-month process, from the time you sign a letter of intent until the time you close. It certainly doesn't need to be that long. It can get done, much more quickly than that. But, and people get tired, and, having that clear understanding on the front end of what you need, is part of, to me, I want to go back when the deal evolves and look and pull out that piece of paper and say to them, okay, this deal has evolved in a way where you're not getting that,
right.
And now are you really okay with that? Or are you just tired of the process? Because, unless you're really okay with it, let's talk about what our other options are. Because, you hate to see somebody obviously sell an asset for less than it's worth because they're tired.
Well, and there's so many things on that too. So just before I want to go back to the dollar amount and how much people need, but think about this. And another reason why what we're doing with our clients that together is so important is you build the relationships with these advisors ahead of time so they know what you want. Because if you go from zero of any of this stuff to, okay, I got an LOI and it's a 5 million, and then you're getting the shit kicked out of you for 6 months, and you're all of a sudden working day and night with these advisors that you don't have relationships with and you might not even like. So it's like, it's so, having that whole thing. So it's like going into a professional football game with a team you've practiced with for a long, long time,
right.
That alone, because I mean, I think about our advisors, our CPA went hunting on a hunting trip in the middle of our transaction. Like, couldn't get a hold of him. I'm like, you serious? Man, like, we're talking about like negotiating big dollar amounts and he's shooting wild boar out of the country. And it's just like,
well, and one of the things I think, you've asked this question before, but one of the things I would say to people, which, might get me in trouble with the lawyers union, but, I think one of the things I always say to people is, if you're talking about hiring somebody to help you put this puzzle together, obviously the most important, puzzle of your life, talk to your other advisors, because one of the dynamics that's out there, if you go hire without inviting your advisors into the process, if you go hire, your brother-in-law's buddy, that's one transaction for that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I'm not suggesting obviously that means they're not going to be professional about it, but when I get a referral from a consultant or an advisor like you, or an accountant or a banker, that's an opportunity to establish a relationship with someone that's going to send a bunch of referral, potentially. And so there's another level. I'm not saying I don't try to do a good job for the person that comes in through my brother-in-law. But I mean, I think when you're in the client chair, having the additional leverage of having your advisors involved early and having, the M&A resource that you ultimately choose feel like they've got skin in the game in terms of a team of advisors that will either be, potentially a source of other opportunities in the future or not. I mean, I think that's additional, protection and sort of leverage for the client.
Well, and let's talk about when we talk about this collaboration, because the integration between tax, legal, and investments is they're all my stupid analogy would be is it's a Venn diagram where 50% of all of those topics are interrelated, but then there's
Totally.
50% that is very special to tax or legal or what. And I think about how many times, Dan, have you seen you've probably been involved in this, where you have a person that, going to the $5 million example again, you have $5 million sale, and then through the checkpoints and because they didn't prep, they get kind of hosed at every checkpoint. And you have no idea whether they're going to be financially secure, because you don't know whether they got 10 million bucks in the bank or not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And you're sitting there going, well, I'm supposed to quote unquote successfully sell this company, but having no idea what's successful to the client. And how different that would be is if we said, okay, Dan, here's client A, they literally only need 2 million at cash at closing to be financially free.
Yep.
Ideally, we want the whole 5, but how that can help you, and then how you can help view the different buyers in that lens. I mean, I don't know if you got kind of some.
Yeah. I mean, first I would say this. I mean, because I think this is really important. I think if you're talking to a lawyer that says you have to use you have to use my guy, the accountant, I want to pick the accountant. I mean, to me, that's a warning sign, right? I mean, we work with a bunch of different people, and my attitude is always, I'm one part of this team. I want to work with whoever you want me to work with, whoever you feel comfortable with. So, on the one end of the spectrum, I think people who want to have the opportunity to kind of hand pick their people and not ever, be willing to collaborate with new people, I think that's dangerous. I think the other side of the equation is, I have said to clients in the middle of a transaction, okay, we've done this, and we've worked with your person. They're not up to it. They can't do it. They don't have the horsepower. They don't have the experience and expertise for this transaction. I'm sure they're great on your other stuff, but we need to get access to another resource. I need to have access to somebody who can answer these questions, because the tax piece, obviously when you're talking about structure of the transaction, you have to get that right on the front end. There's no going back and fixing it. So, right. I think you want, if I was being interviewed by a client and they said, will you promise to work with my person? I would say, I'll promise to work with your person. And I'll promise that if your person isn't up to it, I'm going to come to you and demand that we add another resource. And, I think to me, there's a lot of M&A people talk about, the hub, the wheel and the hub. And I don't really think about it that way. I think you have a team of advisors, all of whom are important, all of whom should be involved. I'm an over cooperator and collaborator. I mean, I want everybody on the team. I want to get the thoughts from the accountant on the stock purchase agreement. I mean, even the pieces of it that aren't tax related, because, they're smart and they have things to add just like the client does. So, I think finding people that are comfortable with collaboration, but also willing, to tell you, hey, we need some more horsepower over here. I mean, to me, that's a big
Well, and
big
when you
piece
have
of
all
what
these advisors that are specializing in the, ideally even the specific transaction that you're trying to go across, but just, transactions in general, they're going to be able to kind of self-regulate each other. Cause I mean, you got attorneys that want billable hours, like
yeah,
accountants might be losing a
yeah,
$6,000 audit. And then the wealth manager
yeah,
wants the liquidation event. And so like you have all these people
yeah,
that kind of different skill sets and different ways that they make money, and rightfully so, but like they can kind of self-regulate themselves if everybody's kind of talking
yeah,
the same thing and the same lingo.
yeah.
So as we're kind
Agree.
of wrapping up here, Dan, this has been a blast, man. What if you're thinking about the listener who just got done with this and they're going, holy cow, that sounds like a lot of work. So right, I mean, which to
Yeah,
get your 5 million
yeah,
cash up front, it is a lot of work, but there's 5 million.
yeah.
But what are
Right.
actionable things that you could say, hey, this is ways
Yeah,
to start biting off the
yeah,
apple without overstressing yourself.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's we offer this all the time, and frankly, we're not as well positioned to do it well as you are, and there, I think, but I think my advice to anybody would be to put a program in place where you have whatever it is. Like I said, I mean, it's sort of one of those things, like when you set out to improve your exercise habits, don't say I'm going to exercise 2 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you haven't done anything in the last 3 years, because you're setting yourself up for failure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, be realistic, but put a program in place where you commit to dedicating some time and some energy and some bandwidth to thinking about what it would look like to sell your business, and then figure out how to get a couple resources that have the ability to help you think about that effectively, because just sitting down in your office and dedicating time to thinking about it, that doesn't do any good unless you have some resources that can help you figure out how to do that in a way that's effective. But that would be my number one thing, would be to encourage people to get out in front of it, because, and you're right, it is a lot of work. I would say 2 things about that. It's not one, you're talking about getting a big bag of money, $5 million. I mean, very few things besides winning the lottery that involve getting $5 million are easy. So, I mean, I'd say, yeah, it's a lot of work. That's a fact. But I would also say it's not as much work if you invest some time on the front end. I mean, where it's really difficult and painful is where you've done nothing to think about what a sale looks like. And then I have this happen with regularity. People come in here and they say, you got a 62-year-old person, business owner, and they come in and they say, you know what, I'm just done with it. It's been a tough stretch. I'm done with it. I want out 3 months from now. Well, I mean, oh my God. I mean, that's a disaster, right? Because it's like, first of all, oftentimes it's been a tough stretch means that the things aren't great at the business. You don't know where you are in terms of cycles. You don't know where the 5 best buyers are in terms of their cycle. I mean, so, those conversations where somebody's like, I mean, it happens, right? You have health things or whatever where you have to do it that way. But those conversations are really tough because we just don't have enough runway to be able to get the thing shined up. So, I mean, my number one advice would be get out in front of it.
Well, and I was gonna say, even to that point, like if they do the right things, so if you run the business like this, then the moment that you're ready to be out, you just pull the trigger and you're done, and you make your $5 million.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or you're collecting $1 million
in
cash flow the whole way.
Yeah. Right. And guess what? Your business will have run better in the interim. That's the other thing is like this, even if you do this, even if you don't sell it for 10 years, you'll make more money and have more fun in the interim.
I know, man.
I mean, I think one of the things that we've talked about, one of the things that goes into this is, there's a lot of people talk a lot about customer centricity, and where you got too many of your eggs in one basket in terms of a customer. Management leadership centricity is a huge issue for buyers as well, especially financial buyers. And so, again, there's a thing where you have to have some meaningful runway to be able to solve that problem. If you have one person who has been the heartbeat of the business, I mean, people have no idea until they're in the, negotiation with the buyer, how much that hurts them on price when the buyer's saying, yeah, but Like you have no lieutenants, you have no deputies. I mean, if you get hit by a bus, this business is over.
Yep.
And, so, I mean, that's another
you can't replace
example of
someone like,
something
you're talking about $125,000 CFO that you need. Like, you got to find them, hire them.
Yeah.
They need probably 12 months to get up to speed. I mean, like, you're talking 18 months before that's even like normalized.
Yeah, exactly. So I just think getting out in front. I really do. I think getting out in front is, you talk about actions that'll deliver return on investment. I think getting out in front and taking, some time to just look at the business through a transaction lens and ask yourself, what would a buyer be worried about? And then, don't make a list of 100 things. Make a list, brainstorm and make your list of 40 things, and then break them into, as you said earlier, break them into 3 or 4 categories and start attacking, the ones that are the most significant. And, if you get to where you identified 40 things you can do and you've only done 15 of them, but you did the 15 most critical, you will have increased the value of the business dramatically.
Well, and I think, Dan, like, to your point, which, a little plug here for what we got going on, this growth and exit boot camp, which is literally just a crash course and all this stuff coming up in October. Like, if there's anything that I think about, like, for as an owner back before we sold, is like, if I just understand this stuff, like, to kind of de-stress this even more, is if they learn, so if the listeners or the sellers learn this stuff, then it's easier to delegate it. It's hard to delegate something you don't know. So that 100 list, you could totally say, here you go, Dan, here you go, CPA, here you go. Like, now you do this stuff because I don't want to do it, but I actually understand what's going on.
Absolutely.
What's the best way to get in touch with you, man? What's the contact information if people want to get in touch?
Yeah, I tell people to call me. I mean, honestly, to me, that's I know that's old school, but I mean, I always like to, I think it's a really efficient and obviously highly confidential way to talk to people. So my direct dial at my office is 612-349-5692. And my cell is 612-227-7568. And I'll just say, I said this to you, contrary to what people think about lawyers, I have a lot of conversations with people about trying to help people get pointed in the right direction where, I never charge them a dime. I mean, this stuff, I like this stuff. I like putting these puzzles together. I like helping people that have built these businesses harvest the value. And so I just, I'm always happy to have these conversations.
Well, and then one last little plug for you too, because the conversation, if the listeners, if you guys and gals want to reach out to Dan, you guys have an interesting business model of being able to do some flat rate projects and stuff like that. That's way more transparent than the endless billable hole that happens a lot. So. Yep.
Transparent. And the other thing is, I just think it aligns interests. I don't want any scenario where my clients are reluctant to call me. I mean, we want to keep the lines open. And so we're obviously trying to figure out ways to make sure that happens.
Dan, this has been a blast, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.